So today we're going to start with a video that I hope is going to become kind of a series of videos about tales of abuse by our Washington State Attorney General, Robert Ferguson, and of course how he plans to put his boot on your face too if he becomes governor. Now, listen, I know in my last video that I was obviously annoyed at the threats of imprisonment for Bob Ferguson's political opponents who had the great misfortune to actually share his same name. Now, in my most recent video, and then I hope that you're actually kind of concerned about that too, but it isn't often that the mask slips and we actually have such a just public opportunity to see what a narcissistic kind of crazy guy actually looks like when he feels like his iron grip on political power is shaken or threatened. Now, of course, the first place that someone like that always goes is to threaten arrest and imprisonment for his political opponents. But it did remind me about the just endless examples that this power-crazed guy has actually given us over the years, which should serve as just a good reason to take a trip down memory lane about why Bob Ferguson is the least qualified person to run for the position of Washington State Governor that we've ever had the misfortune to place on a ballot in our state. Now, before I get into why, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and share button down below if you haven't already. And please make sure, of course, you share this video with others. The more you do, the more others are going to see it as well. Now, back to our Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Nobody in living memory has probably done more to Washington State to basically destroy the rule of law, our state constitution, or essentially the future of our children than our Attorney General Bob Ferguson. But it might benefit us to just go back and then look at some examples from the recent past so that people become more familiar with the damage that Ferguson plans to do to you and to I, of course, and especially to our neighbors in this great state of Washington. Now, one example many of us have discussed various times in the past, and I believe it continues to rear its kind of ugly head, is just A.G. Bob Ferguson's pet project to create our state's equivalent of the Ministry of Truth, which was the term that George Orwell first coined in his dystopian novel 1984, which he published back in 1949. Now, this book was once considered a kind of classic warning of the potential for big government or big brother to essentially create an all-encompassing, centrally kind of controlled police and surveillance state that was designed to manipulate and manage the masses of people through just total mass surveillance and totalitarianism, kind of a monopoly of violence, and of course a type of repressive regimentation of society and the people to ensure that basically none dare dissent. Now, in Orwell's novel, a person living in this type of society was not allowed to question authority, think differently, or have any thought that was not spoon-fed to them by Big Brother. Our Attorney General here, Bob Ferguson, like many of us who went to school before Common Core and the modern kind of collapse of the education system, he probably read or is at least marginally familiar with this novel. But unlike you and I, for whom Orwell's 1984 and the author's equally famous work, Animal Farm, these books are cautionary tales of dystopian scenarios that are inevitably created by an abusive big government and kind of collectivist mindset. So to you and I, at least they should be for most of the rest of us. However, unfortunately for Bob Ferguson, he does appear to view them as instruction manuals for how he plans to run our government. And he proved this with his push of HB, that's House Bill 1333, not 1666. Instead, it was 1333. And it was a bill that he has recommended to the legislature for years now, and which he seems obsessively focused on implementing, even if the legislature has rejected it so far. Now, House Bill 1333 comes the closest that our state has ever been to creating our own version of the Ministry of Truth, using captured and controlled stakeholders, approved by Ferguson, of course, who will then identify enemies of the state as anyone who essentially disagrees with him or his political allies. Now, it's very murky how he actually wants to punish those who disagree with him, but as we saw at his press conference on Monday, clearly when he feels politically threatened, the first thing that Ferguson does is threaten arrest, prison, and financial destruction using the awesome, the terrifying, and essentially unchecked power of the state to destroy all who stand in his way. Now, I produced a video about this at the time, which I'll link to down below, that was most disappointing, and this to me anyway, was the most disappointing about this fact, was that the traditional media sources, they did not react negatively to the idea of creating this type of surveillance and unapproved narrative that suppresses the truth. Partly this is because insiders or stakeholders, they always like the idea so long as they are part of that insider club or stakeholders at the table, as referred to in the original bill draft. And of course, since they expect to be involved in making decisions on who gets labeled, canceled, persecuted, and destroyed, well, then they apparently believe that they're not going to be the ones who are targeted so they can benefit and they can then punish their political enemies. And I mean, listen, this is obviously a crazy idea that was very clearly, inevitably leads to no good outcome. Even a child or an Evergreen State College student can see how this type of program will be weaponized and abused. Now, I believe such an insane and abusive concept would never have actually been proposed or at least written down as black letter bill draft form and then promoted by anybody, even just 30 years ago. And any politician who would have tried back then, and this is true regardless of their political affiliation, they would have been denounced by those who actually care about freedom and free speech, and that used to include our local media. But today, this is essentially what we've seen our federal government push, and Ferguson is perfectly happy to be the volunteer enforcer, kind of the local enforcer who's going to wear the boot that inevitably stamps on all free speech and independent thought in our state. Now, his original proposal at the time conveniently made him the dictator of that project so that he could weaponize it against his political opposition this time. But now that he aspires to be governor, as long as nobody defeats him in November, I'm sure that he wouldn't mind controlling the surveillance-approved narrative protection scheme. And, of course, the propaganda operation from the governor's mansion, should our state make the terrible mistake of actually letting him get that far. Now, this is just one example of many others, and there's tons of them, of just kind of this nasty quest for power that Ferguson's unchecked future abuses are inevitably going to create. Abusers and tyrants will usually signal their pathological tendencies to us in advance. And in history, they usually have. And since the nature of man never really changes, I believe they always will. Now, we must be willing to see the warning signs and then recognize them for what they really are. Because there are a lot of leftists and socialists today who are kind of cheering whenever somebody like Ferguson or another government official abuses their power and weaponizes the awesome power of the state to attack somebody that they don't like. Maybe it's Donald Trump, who has kind of been used as some type of boogeyman to just create this almost Pavlovian response of 2 minutes of hate, which is another Orwellian reference, in just so many otherwise apparently normal people. And perhaps it's the hundreds of people who are absurdly locked away for being present, daring to be present, in D.C. on January 6th, over 3 years ago. And I see every day people on the left celebrate this abuse and this abuse of prosecutorial discretion, especially, with just open glee and giddiness. And they revel and they celebrate the harm that are inflicted on others. Now, perhaps these neighbors on the left think that it's funny to watch Ferguson marshal the vast, unchecked, and extensively weaponized Attorney General's office to destroy the lives of people like Tim Eyman in one of the most disproportionately prosecuted cases in Washington state history. I mean, how dare Tim Eyman wear stupid T-shirts and costumes, pushing initiatives that horrors of horrors actually cut taxes. I mean, he must be destroyed. Not defeated, but personally destroyed and eventually killed. And Bob Ferguson, just all he needed was an excuse. And then our laws today, unfortunately, provide plenty of those. Now, Ferguson recognizes this desire on the far left, this desire to imprison and punish their political enemies, just like other tyrants throughout history have kind of recognized that they can use their power to abuse disfavored minorities and others to curry favor with a motivated, crazy constituency. I mean, the power mad will always abuse their position to do this. They're going to always try to appease people like this. Human nature never changes. And neither do power-hungry narcissists, and particularly those who are, I believe, psychopaths. Now, this is just who they are and always will be. We've been warned with countless examples throughout history, but we rarely listen or pay attention. The common myopic, kind of arrogant, and I believe naive view of most people today is that this just can't happen to us. And yet the cry for blood and division is just the same from the left today as it ever was at any other time in history when the mobs get worked up into a frenzy. It doesn't matter if the mob wanted to throw them to the lions or crucify them or burn them at the stake or march them to the camps. The motivation and the human aspect of this desire really has never changed. The other lesson that these angry leftists, socialists, and Democrats in our state forget is, well, they love watching people that they've been conditioned to hate, who in turn get destroyed by Big Brother. These same cheerleaders, they never seem to realize that every revolution always eats its own. Today, it's fun for them to laugh at Tim Eyman. But with power-mad psychopaths like Ferguson in charge, many of them will eventually be targeted as well. And it might not be for a few years, but this will eventually happen. Now, when I produced my last video, I realized that there were just too many stories about Ferguson over the past few years, and he has demonstrated exactly who he is. And I couldn't possibly do even a fraction of these stories because they're too big and there's just too many of them, so I can't do enough justice to them in the short time that I would have for any one video. Even a very long video. So I believe that I'm just going to need to do a series of videos to properly illustrate Ferguson's just lengthy history of deception and persecution, corruption, and dishonesty in our state. I think this is important. I mean, listen, there's actually a lot of corrupt people in government. Ferguson doesn't have a monopoly on this. Most of these politicians or bureaucrats, they're just self-serving, kind of corrupt people who have insatiable egos and often are not all that super capable at anything. And frankly, if they were truly capable or skilled, they wouldn't actually probably be doing what they do right now in government. They would probably be doing something far more productive. Now, it's certainly annoying to watch them profit from their position, and they preen for the attention, and they bumble through the day. But other than the collective drag on society and the waste of our life energy in the form of taxes that we give them, these types of politicians and bureaucrats, they don't generally represent a clear and present danger to your life, liberty, or freedom. These politicians and senior bureaucrats, they might deserve to be replaced or mocked, of course, or exposed, but generally they just won't willfully seek to hurt you. However, there are power-mad people out there who come along sometimes with their egos, uncontained by this universe, and they have power aspirations that have no real limit. And these are the dangerous ones. They're never as smart as they think they are, but they're intelligent enough to know how to kind of wield the levers of power for their own powerful aspirations. Now, unfortunately, as they get a taste for abusing others, particularly the defenseless or those without power to adequately resist them, then these politicians discover that they like it. And this is our Attorney General running for governor right now. This is the threat that I believe he represents to us today. Now, I'm going to break this series of videos into essentially just 3 categories of analysis, and I'll try to produce at least one per week, in addition to my other videos that I plan to launch over the rest of the year. I can't cover every level of abuse, and I can't cover every person or group that, of course, he's harmed, but the first category of videos will be just victim stories. And when you have an abuser like this guy, like Bob Ferguson, he always leaves behind just a trail of victims, and their stories need to be told. And I believe that's going to be one primary category of video. The second category of video and story will be themed around the stories of corruption. Ferguson isn't the only corrupt politician out there, of course, but more people should be made aware of his corruption as well. Now, generally, these will be examples of his misuse of public resources to bribe constituencies, donors, and voters, and to profit himself politically. The third category of story will be more focused on the Ferguson stories that don't really easily fit into any one of the first 2 categories. Now, I am challenged with limiting myself to just one video on this subject, and one video a week anyway, but I have other topics and stories that I need to cover this year as well, so I figured one video a week at least on this subject. Since Ferguson mentioned me 13 times in his press conference on Monday while threatening to arrest and jail his political opponents, and since he originally had been picked lucky position number 13 by the Secretary of State during the drawing on that ballot, I'll plan my first 13 videos and then see where we go from there. I get more motivated to focus on politicians when they demonstrate a particular level of evil, weirdness, or corruption, and this guy Ferguson has plenty of all 3 to go around. So listen, I usually try to end my videos with a call to action, and I want people to become more involved, but in the political process, I do find that, of course, I'm looking down and reading the comments sometimes, and sometimes from real people, they aren't all, that voting just doesn't matter. That the implications being that, of course, when I say show up, I'm only referring to the task of voting. So I want to clear something up here. Voting is really just the bare minimum level of civic engagement every one of us should participate in. The process, if flawed, of course, imperfect, of course, and there are absolutely problems. This is particularly true with mail-in voting, which is why many countries have actually made it illegal. Now, I know these problems better than most. However, it is stunningly pathetic and irrational to say that you won't vote like that is some kind of virtue signaling position to hold. It's not. It's just handing your ballot over to the opposition. It is such a minor task to complete your ballot and deliver it to the auditor's office. It's essentially doesn't take much time at all. And for most of us, this step takes less than 30 minutes, and it's far less time consuming than watching a Netflix video, and it costs you nothing but the small amount of time that you spend. Now, most of you who watch my video probably do vote, but encouraging others to vote, too, it's not the total solution either, but it is the barest least effort, I believe, that you can make. No, when I'm actually referring to showing up, I actually mean physically engaging and showing up, getting out of bed, off the couch, and active and doing something to make an impact. There's a variety of ways to do that, but voting is really just the smallest part. You have influence with others. You do. We all do. And you don't have to get into screaming matches with crazies on the street. I don't think that's terribly effective. But you have a social, work, or neighborhood, or some other social influence sphere where you can provide information, discuss issues, share stories that are ignored by the media. And just a hint here, every story they ignore, these are the stories you should probably share. Now, in addition, you can engage in other ways. Research your local government, for example. Research your local elected officials and senior bureaucrats. Research your local government budgets and other actions. Start analyzing how it actually works. Who are the players? Who are the grifters? How do they waste your money and how does it work? Attend some public meetings, at least 3 of them in a row for whatever government, local government that you care about. It could be a school board or a fire district, maybe your county commissioners or city council, whatever. And then start to better understand how it works. And then finally, once you start to engage in small ways, the more impactful opportunities become obvious and then open to you, it's going to be more obvious. But if you don't show up, your future is going to belong to whoever does. And right now, many of the people who do show up are simply setting the agenda, and you're on the menu. So that is what I mean by showing up. It's more than just voting, more than just praying. It is about showing up to make an impact. Because you need to do it in your own way with your friends, your neighbors, and allies. Because in the end, the future inevitably belongs to those who show up.